Every year in the United States, hundreds of thousands of women have an abortion. Abortion is one of the safest medical procedures for women in the U.S., with an extremely low complication rate. And yet, there's a pervasive stigma surrounding abortion in this country. Planned Parenthood is trying to change that. To find out more, I spoke with Becca Karpinski, Vice President of Strategy for Planned Parenthood in the Pacific Southwest. Becca, how did abortion become so stigmatized in the U.S.?
I think that's a great question. I think that the idea of abortion has been stigmatized across cultures for a very long time. And I think that's tied to really the stigma attached to sexuality, and particularly women's sexuality. Just like women didn't have a lot of control over who they married, when they had children, those kinds of things, abortion was kind of part of that package and stigmatized that way. I feel like we started to see some change in that stigma with the women's rights movement in the 60s and 70s, where abortion started to be part of empowering women. And back then, it wasn't really a partisan issue. So if you think about Governor Reagan in California was the one to legalize abortion in California before Roe versus Wade, right? So there was kind of this motion toward abortion being a little bit more acceptable. And then what happened in sort of like maybe the mid-90s or so, abortion started to become a political topic and it became a partisan issue. And I think that's when a lot of the stigma like really kind of started to increase again.
Now, we don't shame women who have breast implants or get a kidney transplant. Why do we shame women who have an abortion?
Right. Well, so it comes back to stigma, right? So the idea of stigma, kind of the definition of it, is that it's something that is socially unacceptable or morally wrong, right? And it's this shared idea in a community about that. So you personally don't have to agree with that it's wrong. It's just this sense in the community that something is wrong. And basically what happens when something is stigmatized is that the people with that attribute, whether it's I had an abortion, whether it's I'm HIV positive, whether it's I suffer from depression, there's lots of things that are stigmatized. But when someone has a stigmatized attribute, they feel shame. And when you feel ashamed, do you talk about it? You don't, right? You stay in silence. And so that silence perpetuates stigma because people think, I don't know anyone with that problem, or I don't know anyone in that situation.
So what are some of the steps that you're planning to take to try to turn that whole thing around?
Well, I think the real power is breaking the silence. So if in that kind of that three-step process, silence is the thing you can affect. So what we're really thinking about is how do we create the spaces and plant the seeds for more fact-based conversations about abortion, right? So that could be kind of people stepping into conversations saying, oh, actually, here's what I know about abortion. Or it could be people telling their personal stories. And because there's so much stigma, they have to feel safe enough to do that. But what we're trying to encourage is people stepping into those conversations a little bit more often. Even if it's telling one person you've never told, it changes the dynamic in a community over time where it's not those people or something kind of separate, but it's like, oh, I know people who've had an abortion.
And what's the role in the media in this whole anti-stigma campaign?
I think the media has such a powerful role. If you think about in movies and television up until, 5-6 years ago, almost every storyline, a character would have an unintended pregnancy and there were two options. Basically like, oh yeah, I'm in love with the baby daddy and it all worked out fine, we're gonna have the child. Or they would have a miscarriage conveniently before they actually went through with an abortion. But what you've seen over the past 5 or 6 years is a lot more storylines that treat abortion in a much more realistic way, where it is part of women's reproductive life. So I don't know if you know this, but 1 in 4 American women will have an abortion by the age of 45. So it's a really common thing. I mean, that's sort of the number of births that end in cesarean section. But people talk about the cesarean sections all the time. That's very normal.
Lastly, what about the political front? I mean, a number of states have passed restrictions on abortions in recent years. Yeah. How do you make inroads in that area?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why we're doing the stigma work. So busting stigma does 2 things. First of all, it helps individual women who have abortions feel less alone in their experiences. But it also makes it much harder to pass restrictions, right? Because the reason it's easy to pass restrictions is folks think, I don't know anyone who has needed an abortion. I don't know anyone who's been in that situation. So yeah, we can restrict it. It's okay. But when you start knowing, oh, this affects people I know and love, it makes it a lot harder to pass those kinds of regulations.